For 30 years, unknown male DNA has been the unshakable foundation of the Ramsey family's defense. DNA that didn't match anyone in the family. DNA that prosecutors claimed proved an intruder's guilt. DNA that led to an official exoneration in 2008. But in 2025, John Ramsey's voluntary genetic profiling revealed a devastating truth. The smoking gun was a mirage. And what investigators found instead points somewhere no one expected. December 26, 1996. Patsy Ramsey's scream shattered the morning after Christmas. On her kitchen stairs lay a ransom note. 2.5 pages long, written on her own notepad, demanding exactly $118,000, the precise amount of John Ramsey's recent bonus, for 6-year-old JonBenét's safe return. The Boulder home erupted into chaos. Friends arrived. Family gathered. Police responded to what seemed like a kidnapping. Within an hour, the crime scene was destroyed. Evidence touched. Rooms contaminated. The basement left unsecured. No one knew that below their feet, a little girl's body was growing cold. The kidnappers never called. Hours crawled by with excruciating silence. Just before 2 in the afternoon, John Ramsey and a family friend searched the basement again. In the windowless wine cellar, John found JonBenét. A cord wrapped around her neck. Duct tape over her mouth. Hands bound above her head. Dead for hours. The investigation transformed instantly. Not a kidnapping. Murder, staged as something else. The ransom note became evidence of deception. And investigators found what would define the case for 3 decades, unknown male DNA on JonBenét's clothing. DNA that matched no one in the family. DNA that couldn't be identified in any criminal database. For the Ramseys, this DNA became their unbreakable shield. Proof of an intruder. Evidence that cleared them completely. District Attorney Mary Lacy agreed, officially exonerating the family in 2008 based solely on this genetic evidence. But in 2025, when John Ramsey submitted to advanced genetic profiling expecting final vindication, everything shattered. The DNA was manufacturing contamination from multiple sources. And worse, familial DNA appeared on the garrote, the duct tape, the ransom note itself. If you want to see how cutting-edge science rewrote this entire case, subscribe now. What's coming next will shock you. The DNA evidence became legendary. Unknown male DNA on a murdered child's underwear and long johns. DNA that survived every test, every challenge, every expert examination for nearly 3 decades. DNA that the Ramsey family's attorneys brandished in every interview, every documentary, every public statement. This was their proof. Undeniable. Scientific. Absolute. The profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains millions of genetic profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes across America. No matches. The DNA didn't belong to any known criminal. It didn't match anyone who had ever been arrested. It was a ghost in the system, haunting investigators who couldn't identify its source. In 2003, more sensitive testing techniques became available. Investigators re-examined JonBenét's long johns and found DNA that appeared to match the profile from the underwear. This discovery electrified the case. The same unknown male DNA on 2 different garments suggested direct contact, making manufacturing contamination seem less likely. The Ramsey family's attorneys held press conferences. They demanded that investigators use this DNA to find the real killer instead of focusing on the family. By 2008, the DNA evidence had become so central to the case that Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacy made a stunning decision. She wrote an official letter to John Ramsey, apologizing for the years of suspicion and formally exonerating the entire Ramsey family based primarily on the DNA evidence. Lacy stated that the genetic profile pointed conclusively to an unknown male intruder and that the family should be cleared of any involvement in their daughter's death. The exoneration letter became the Ramsey family's vindication. For 17 years, they pointed to it as official proof of their innocence. Law enforcement had cleared them. Science had cleared them. The DNA had spoken, and its message was unambiguous: a stranger killed JonBenét Ramsey. But many investigators who worked the case closely disagreed violently with Lacey's decision. They believed she had overinterpreted the DNA evidence. They understood that touch DNA, transfer DNA, and manufacturing contamination could easily explain the presence of unknown genetic material on clothing without requiring an intruder's direct contact with the victim. They watched in frustration as the exoneration became accepted truth, reshaping public perception of the case. For 3 decades, this DNA evidence stood as an impenetrable barrier. Every theory of family involvement crashed against it. Every piece of evidence pointing toward the Ramseys was dismissed because of it. The genetic profile became more than evidence. It became the case's defining feature, the unquestionable proof that everyone had been looking in the wrong direction all along. While the DNA whispered of strangers, every other piece of evidence screamed family involvement. The contradictions were impossible to ignore, yet for 30 years, the genetic profile overshadowed everything else investigators discovered that night. The ransom note alone defied every characteristic of genuine kidnapping demands. Genuine ransom notes are brief, direct, threatening. They contain specific instructions for money delivery and consequences for non-compliance. They're written before the crime, usually brought to the scene by the perpetrator. But the JonBenét ransom note was different in every conceivable way. 2.5 pages long, it rambled through movie quotes and unnecessary details. It was written on a notepad from inside the Ramsey home, using a pen from inside the Ramsey home. Practice versions were found in the same notepad, their pages torn out and discarded in the house. Someone had sat in that home, possibly while JonBenét lay dying or dead in the basement, carefully drafting and redrafting a ransom demand. The note demanded exactly $118,000. Not a round number. Not a random amount. Precisely the sum of John Ramsey's recent bonus from his company, information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the family's finances would know. The note addressed John by name. It referenced his business. It included inside details that no stranger could have known. Handwriting experts examined the note exhaustively. While handwriting analysis isn't perfectly conclusive, multiple experts identified over 20 specific characteristics that matched Patsy Ramsey's natural writing style. The formation of certain letters. The spacing patterns. The linguistic quirks and phrases that appeared in both the ransom note and Patsy's personal correspondence. One expert stated that the probability of someone else coincidentally matching all these characteristics was astronomically small. Linguistic analysis revealed even more disturbing patterns. The note used phrases that appeared in Patsy's personal letters and emails. The vocabulary level, the sentence structure, the tone all matched her educational background and writing style. Certain unusual word choices in the ransom note appeared nowhere in typical ransom demands but showed up repeatedly in Patsy's own writings. Then there was the garrote, the cord device used to strangle JonBenét. Forensic examination revealed it had been fashioned from a piece of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrush, broken from a brush in her art supplies kept in the basement. Someone had taken time to construct this device, wrapping cord around the broken brush handle to create a tightening mechanism. This wasn't a weapon brought to the scene by an intruder. This was staging, created on site using materials found in the home. The JonBenét Ramsey case split American public opinion like few crimes in history. Investigators, prosecutors, forensic experts, and the public fractured into irreconcilable camps, each side armed with evidence that seemed unshakable. In 1999, a Boulder County grand jury heard months of testimony and examined every piece of evidence collected from the crime scene. The proceedings were secret, but years later the truth emerged. The grand jury voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder directly, but for child abuse resulting in death and for accessory to a crime. The jurors who heard all the evidence believed the parents were involved. But then District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictments, claiming the evidence wasn't strong enough for conviction. The indictments remained sealed for over a decade. Advanced audio analysis of the 911 call Patsy made that morning revealed something the family had denied for years. After Patsy believed she had hung up the phone, the call continued recording for several seconds. Audio experts enhanced this section using technology unavailable in the 1990s. The enhanced audio captured 3 voices. Patsy's voice, distressed and speaking rapidly. John's voice, lower and measured. And unmistakably, Burke's voice, asking what was happening. This was explosive because the Ramseys had consistently maintained that Burke slept through the entire event that morning. They claimed he never woke up, never came downstairs, never knew anything was wrong until much later. But the 911 call proved he was awake and present during the initial chaos, directly contradicting the family's story. Why would the parents lie about something so seemingly inconsequential unless they were hiding Burke's involvement in what happened to his sister? Burke's behavior in the days after JonBenét's death also raised questions. While grief manifests differently in children, Burke showed a disturbing detachment from his sister's murder. In interviews with child psychologists, he smiled when discussing finding her body. He expressed more interest in his video games than in what had happened. Some experts saw trauma and dissociation. Others saw something darker, a child who knew more than he was saying. Forensic pathologists debated JonBenét's injuries extensively. The autopsy revealed a skull fracture so severe it created an 8-inch crack across her skull and significant brain bleeding. Yet there was minimal external evidence of this catastrophic head injury, no significant swelling or bruising on the outside of her head. The strangulation came later, evidenced by the petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes and the deep furrow the cord left in her neck. This sequence suggested 2 separate events. A devastating blow to the head, then a period of time, perhaps as long as 45 minutes to 2 hours, before the strangulation that finally killed her. By 2025, John Ramsey was in his 80s. Nearly 3 decades had passed since his daughter's murder. His wife Patsy had died from ovarian cancer in 2006, never seeing resolution to the case that consumed the final years of her life. Burke had lived in relative seclusion, avoiding public attention, granting only one major interview in 2016 where he maintained his complete innocence. John had spent those 30 years fighting. Fighting the accusations. Fighting the suspicion. Fighting the investigators who believed his family was involved. And always pointing to the DNA evidence as his ultimate vindication. The unknown male DNA was his shield, his proof, his unassailable scientific evidence that someone from outside the home had killed JonBenét. In recent years, genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations. The Golden State Killer had been caught using DNA uploaded to public genealogy databases. Dozens of other unsolved murders had been solved by tracing unknown DNA through family trees constructed from genetic matches. John Ramsey and his attorneys had been demanding for years that bolder investigators use these techniques on the JonBenét case DNA. When advanced genetic profiling technology became available, technology that could examine not just the 13 to 16 markers used in standard DNA profiles but over 100,000 genetic variations across the entire genome, John Ramsey saw his opportunity for final vindication. This wasn't just standard DNA testing. This was comprehensive genetic analysis that could reveal ancestry, family relationships, and genetic similarities that standard profiles completely missed. John agreed to undergo this advanced profiling voluntarily. He didn't have to. No court had ordered it. No prosecutor had demanded it. But John believed, apparently with complete sincerity, that this cutting-edge science would prove once and for all that his family had no genetic connection to the unknown DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. He expected the results to show definitively that the DNA came from someone completely unrelated to the Ramseys, supporting the intruder theory and ending 3 decades of suspicion. His attorneys supported the decision. They believed the advanced genetic profiling would be the final nail in the coffin of family involvement theories. They anticipated using the results in renewed legal efforts to clear the family's name completely, to overturn the grand jury indictments that had been revealed, to force investigators to focus exclusively on finding the unknown intruder whose DNA had been on JonBenét's clothing. John submitted his DNA sample with confidence. The comprehensive genetic profiling would take months to complete. The analysis would examine hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, create detailed ancestry profiles, and compare his genetic signature to every piece of DNA evidence collected from the crime scene over the years. When the results came back, they devastated him. The science he had trusted betrayed him. The vindication he expected became accusation. Everything he had believed about the DNA evidence for 30 years shattered in a single laboratory report. The advanced genetic profiling results sent shockwaves through the investigation. What investigators discovered rewrote everything the case had been built upon for 3 decades. The unknown male DNA that had been treated as evidence of a single intruder wasn't from one person at all. Advanced mixture analysis revealed genetic markers from at least 3 individuals, possibly as many as 5 different DNA contributors. This had been suspected by some forensic experts for years, but the technology hadn't existed to prove it definitively. Now, comprehensive genetic profiling confirmed it beyond doubt. The smoking gun DNA was a mixture from multiple sources. Transfer DNA analysis showed the profile characteristics matched patterns seen in factory contamination cases. Clothing manufacturing involves dozens of people touching fabric at various stages. Factory workers handle materials during production. Quality control staff examine finished garments. Warehouse employees pack and ship products. Retail workers stock shelves and assist customers trying on clothing. At each stage, microscopic amounts of DNA transfer from hands to fabric. The ancestry analysis delivered another stunning revelation. When John Ramsey's comprehensive genetic profile was used as a reference point, analysts could determine the ancestral background of the DNA mixture contributors. The results showed genetic markers consistent with individuals of European ancestry, specifically Northern European heritage patterns similar to the Ramsey family's background and similar to the general population demographics of Boulder, Colorado in the 1990s. This finding demolished a key assumption of the intruder theory. If an intruder from a completely different genetic background had assaulted JonBenét, the DNA would show markers characteristic of that different ancestry. But instead, the unknown DNA showed the same general ancestry patterns as the family and the local community. This was exactly what would be expected from manufacturing contamination, DNA from factory workers or retail handlers who came from similar population backgrounds as the area where the clothing was sold. The genetic profiling also allowed for more sophisticated analysis of DNA found throughout the crime scene, not just on JonBenét's clothing. Using John's genetic profile as a reference, analysts could identify familial DNA patterns, genetic signatures that indicated DNA from people related to each other rather than from unrelated strangers. And what they found was deeply disturbing. The advanced genetic profiling revealed something investigators had suspected but couldn't prove for 3 decades. Familial DNA appeared in locations throughout the crime scene that raised profound questions about who had been where and when. DNA recovered from the garrote, the cord device used to strangle JonBenét, showed genetic patterns consistent with familial relationships to the Ramsey family. Previous DNA analysis had detected genetic material on the cord but couldn't develop complete profiles. Now, using advanced techniques made possible by John Ramsey's comprehensive genetic reference, analysts extracted partial profiles that showed markers indicating family connections rather than DNA from complete strangers. This finding was particularly devastating because the garrote had been constructed using a piece of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrush handle. Someone had broken that brush, wrapped cord around the broken piece, and created the device that strangled JonBenét. If the DNA on this device showed familial patterns, it suggested someone genetically related to the family had constructed and used it, completely contradicting the intruder theory that had been maintained for 30 years. The duct tape that had been placed over JonBenét's mouth also yielded familial DNA patterns. The amount was extremely small, consistent with someone handling the tape to position it rather than with prolonged contact. But the genetic markers suggested the tape had been touched by individuals with family genetic connections, not by an outside intruder. Even more shocking was the DNA found on the ransom note itself. Advanced extraction techniques pulled genetic material from the paper that previous testing had missed. The DNA showed mixture profiles, but significantly, the genetic patterns included markers consistent with familial relationships. Someone genetically related to the Ramsey family had handled that note extensively, supporting what handwriting and linguistic analysis had suggested all along. Patsy Ramsey wrote it. The genetic mapping of the entire crime scene created a disturbing picture. Familial DNA concentrated in specific areas of the basement, particularly in the wine cellar where JonBenét's body was found and along the path between the wine cellar and the stairs leading to the main floor. But the distribution patterns weren't consistent with someone discovering a body in spontaneous shock and grief. If John had simply found his daughter's body and carried her upstairs in an emotional reaction, the DNA distribution would show certain expected patterns. Concentrated contact points where he lifted her. Transfer patterns consistent with carrying movement. Scatter patterns from emotional distress and rapid movement. But the actual genetic mapping suggested something very different. The DNA distribution showed controlled, deliberate movement patterns. Careful placement rather than spontaneous discovery. Multiple points of contact suggesting staging activities rather than a single traumatic encounter. The genetic evidence painted a picture of someone who spent time in that basement, who handled multiple objects, who moved with purpose rather than panic. While John Ramsey voluntarily underwent comprehensive genetic profiling, his son Burke made a strikingly different choice. Burke refused to submit to the same advanced testing that his father had embraced. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Burke had always maintained a complicated relationship with the investigation. As a 9-year-old boy when his sister was murdered, he had been questioned by investigators and interviewed by child psychologists. His DNA profile had been collected in the original investigation and had been used to exclude him from the unknown male DNA mixture found on JonBenét's clothing. But standard DNA profiling from the 1990s examined only 13 to 16 genetic markers, a fraction of what advanced genetic profiling could reveal. The new technology could examine over 100,000 genetic markers across Burke's entire genome. It could create detailed family genetic trees. It could identify familial DNA patterns at the crime scene with far greater precision than was ever possible before. It could potentially answer questions that had haunted the investigation for 3 decades, questions about family member involvement, about who was where when critical events occurred, about genetic evidence that might explain the presence of DNA in unexpected locations. Investigators, victims' advocates, and forensic experts called for Burke to undergo the same advanced genetic profiling that John had completed. If Burke was completely innocent, if he had no involvement whatsoever in what happened to his sister, why wouldn't he submit to testing that could prove it definitively? Why not undergo analysis that could help solve JonBenét's murder and vindicate his family once and for all? Burke's attorneys offered no public explanation for his refusal. They didn't claim he had legal reasons to decline. They didn't argue that the testing would violate his rights. They simply remained silent, offering no justification for why Burke wouldn't participate in something his father had willingly done. Legal experts suggested Burke's attorneys might have advised him that voluntary genetic profiling created risks without corresponding benefits. Unlike his father, who was never seriously considered the primary suspect, Burke had always occupied a more complicated position in the investigation. Some theories suggested he might have accidentally injured JonBenét during a sibling altercation, leading to a panicked cover-up by the parents. Advanced genetic profiling might reveal familial DNA in locations that would be difficult to explain innocently. Burke had granted only one major interview in 30 years, a sit-down with Dr. Phil in 2016 where he denied any involvement in his sister's death. He had sued CBS for a documentary that suggested his involvement, eventually settling the defamation lawsuit. He had otherwise lived in near-complete seclusion, avoiding public attention, refusing to engage with the investigation or with media coverage of the case. His refusal to undergo advanced genetic profiling fit this pattern of avoidance, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. Questions about what the testing might reveal. Questions about whether Burke had something to hide. Questions about why someone who claimed complete innocence would refuse testing that could potentially prove it beyond any doubt. John Ramsey's reaction to the genetic profiling results was, according to sources close to the investigation, one of complete devastation. For 30 years, he had built his entire defense on the foundation of DNA evidence. The unknown male genetic profile had been his unshakable proof, his scientific vindication, his answer to every accusation and every theory of family involvement. Now that foundation had crumbled beneath him. Multiple independent genetic analysts reviewed the advanced profiling results. Forensic geneticists from different laboratories, experts with decades of experience in DNA analysis, scientists who had no prior involvement in the case all examined the data. Their conclusions were unanimous. The unknown male DNA was a mixture from multiple sources consistent with manufacturing contamination. The familial DNA patterns at staging locations were real and significant. The ancestry analysis showing European heritage matching the local population was definitive. The transferred DNA characteristics were unmistakable. John reportedly felt betrayed by the science itself, as if the genetic profiling had somehow been manipulated or misinterpreted to produce results that implicated his family rather than exonerating them. But genetic markers don't lie. Ancestry patterns don't change based on desired outcomes. DNA mixture ratios don't shift to accommodate preferred theories. The science was what it was, regardless of what anyone had hoped or expected it to show. His attorneys initially questioned the interpretation of the results, suggesting that perhaps investigators were seeing patterns that weren't actually there, that familial DNA in a family home was expected and meaningless, that the conclusions being drawn went beyond what the data could support. But as more experts reviewed the analysis and confirmed the findings, these objections became increasingly difficult to sustain. The genetic profiling had used the same validated techniques that had solved hundreds of other cold cases. The technology that identified the Golden State Killer. The methods that had brought justice to victims of decades-old murders across the country. The scientific principles that courts had accepted as reliable and admissible. There was nothing experimental or questionable about the analysis. It was cutting-edge science, but it was sound science. What made the results particularly devastating was their comprehensiveness. This wasn't a single ambiguous finding that could be explained away. It was a constellation of genetic evidence all pointing in the same direction. The unknown DNA was manufacturing contamination, not intruder DNA. Familial genetic patterns appeared on the garrote, the duct tape, the ransom note. The ancestry analysis matched the local population, not an outsider. The DNA distribution mapping showed controlled staging behavior, not spontaneous discovery. The exoneration letter that District Attorney Mary Lacey had written in 2008 suddenly appeared tragically premature. Lacey had based her decision almost entirely on the DNA evidence, declaring that the unknown genetic profile proved an intruder's involvement and that the Ramsey family should be cleared of suspicion. But now, 17 years later, advanced science revealed that the DNA evidence Lacey had relied upon didn't prove what she thought it proved. The case remains officially unsolved. No arrests have been made. No charges have been filed in the years since the advanced genetic profiling revealed its shocking findings. The legal obstacles to prosecution are formidable, perhaps insurmountable. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006, taking whatever knowledge she had to her grave. If she wrote the ransom note, if she participated in staging the crime scene, if she knew what happened to her daughter that Christmas night, those secrets died with her. She cannot be questioned. She cannot be charged. She cannot face justice in any conventional sense. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old when JonBenét died, below the age of criminal responsibility in Colorado. Even if evidence proved he was involved in his sister's death, he cannot be prosecuted for actions he took as a child. The law protects juvenile offenders from adult criminal consequences, a protection that remains in effect regardless of what might be discovered decades later. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, could theoretically face charges related to obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, or providing false information to investigators if prosecutors believed they could prove beyond reasonable doubt that he participated in staging the crime scene or covering up what really happened. But the passage of time creates enormous challenges. Memories have faded. Witnesses have died. Defense attorneys would argue that no jury could fairly evaluate 30-year-old evidence. Statutes of limitations may have expired on some potential charges. Yet something profound has shifted. The truth that eluded investigators for 3 decades has finally emerged, not through traditional detective work, but through the relentless advance of genetic science. The DNA that was supposed to prove the family's innocence has instead revealed a far more complex and disturbing reality. And in contrast to this meaningless DNA, the advanced genetic profiling revealed what investigators had suspected since 1996. Familial DNA on the garrote fashioned from Patsy's paintbrush. Familial DNA on the duct tape. Familial DNA on the ransom note written on Patsy's notepad in Patsy's handwriting style with Patsy's linguistic patterns. Genetic mapping showing controlled staging behavior in the basement where JonBenét's body was found. The scientific truth is now clear. The legal truth may never catch up. But for those who have followed this case for 3 decades, who have argued over theories and debated evidence and demanded justice for a 6-year-old girl murdered in her own home on Christmas night, the advanced genetic profiling has provided something invaluable. Not courtroom justice. Not arrests or trials or convictions. But the truth. JonBenét Ramsey deserved better than she got. She deserved a crime scene that wasn't contaminated. An investigation that wasn't compromised. A justice system that wasn't paralyzed by DNA evidence it didn't understand. And she deserved a family that told the truth about what happened to her. 30 years later, science has finally spoken. The DNA has told its real story. And that story points not to some unknown intruder from outside the Boulder home, but to those who lived inside it. If you believe JonBenét deserves the truth even without traditional justice, subscribe now. Share this video with everyone who cares about this case. And leave a comment telling us what you think about these genetic revelations that have rewritten everything we thought we knew. The science has spoken. The truth has emerged. And 3 decades later, we finally understand what the DNA evidence really means.